In the winter of 1971, a young currency trader named Marcus Feld stood inside a crowded Zurich exchange house, watching a wall of screens flicker with numbers that made no sense to him yet. He had only been working there for 6 months, and already the older traders around him were whispering about something they called the shortcut, a phrase spoken with equal parts fascination and dread. Marcus didn't understand at first why grown men who had spent decades in finance looked so uneasy discussing something as simple as a government spending more money than it collected. Every nation did that occasionally, he assumed, the same way a household might dip into savings during a difficult month. What he slowly came to realize, through months of watching currencies rise and collapse without warning, was that this particular shortcut was never really simple at all. When governments couldn't raise enough through taxes or borrowing, they had another option sitting quietly in reserve, one that felt almost like magic the first time you understood it. They could simply create more money. No new factories needed to be built, no additional labor required, no real wealth generated at all. Just new currency summoned into existence with the stroke of a pen or the click of a keyboard. For the politicians who chose this path, it looked like the perfect answer to an impossible problem. Roads could be built, wars could be funded, promises could be kept, all without the political pain of raising taxes or the discipline of cutting spending. Marcus watched this pattern repeat itself across different countries throughout his early career, always following a strangely familiar script. It would begin with a genuine crisis, a war, a recession, a natural disaster, something that demanded immediate spending far beyond what the Treasury actually had on hand. Rather than face the uncomfortable choice between raising taxes or admitting the country couldn't afford everything at once, leaders would quietly turn to their central banks. New money would enter the economy, and for a brief, intoxicating moment, everything would feel fine. Government workers got paid, contractors received their checks, citizens saw new programs rolled out without a single new line item on their tax bill. It felt, for a while, like something impossibly close to free money. But Marcus had already learned enough about how currencies actually worked to recognize the danger hiding beneath that comfortable illusion. Money wasn't wealth itself. It was only a claim on real things, on goods, on services, on the labor of real people doing real work. When new currency entered an economy without any matching increase in actual production, every unit of that currency already in circulation became worth a little less. It was the same principle as pouring more water into a pitcher of juice without adding any more juice concentrate. The pitcher looked fuller, but the flavor, the actual value, grew weaker with every pour. This dilution rarely announced itself immediately, which was precisely what made it so dangerous to everyday citizens. Prices didn't spike overnight. They crept upward slowly, month after month, until people simply accepted higher costs as the new normal without ever questioning why. Marcus began tracking these patterns obsessively, filling notebooks with observations from country after country that had tried the exact same shortcut. Argentina in the 1980s, Brazil in the same decade, and eventually stories reaching back to Germany in the 1920s. A case so extreme it had become a permanent warning etched into economic textbooks. Each situation looked different on the surface, different currencies, different politicians, different original crises that had started the entire chain reaction. But underneath every single case, Marcus found the same fundamental mechanism operating with almost mathematical precision. Governments spent more than they collected. Central banks created new money to cover the gap. That new money diluted the value of every dollar, peso, or mark already sitting in someone's pocket. By the mid-1970s, Marcus had moved from simply observing this pattern to genuinely fearing where it might lead if left completely unchecked. He watched inflation numbers climb steadily across several major economies, watched central bankers insist publicly that everything remained under control, while privately scrambling behind closed doors. The public rarely understood what was actually happening to their money, and that lack of understanding was exactly what allowed the pattern to repeat itself again and again across different decades. Citizens blamed greedy landlords for rising rents, blamed grocery stores for rising prices, blamed anyone and everyone except the actual source sitting quietly at the center of it all. Politicians, for their part, rarely had any incentive to explain the true mechanism to voters who might not fully understand economics. It was far easier to promise new programs, fund them through quiet currency creation, and let the resulting inflation arrive gradually enough that no single leader could ever be blamed directly for the consequences. Marcus began to suspect that this wasn't merely an occasional policy mistake made by careless or incompetent leaders. It appeared, disturbingly, to be a recurring temptation built directly into the structure of modern government finance itself, one that almost no nation seemed capable of resisting indefinitely once the door had been opened, even slightly. By 1979, Marcus had transferred to a research desk where his growing obsession with monetary history finally found a proper outlet. His supervisor, a soft-spoken economist named Dr. Ingrid Halvorsen, had spent nearly 20 years studying currency collapses across 3 continents, and she took an immediate interest in the young trader who kept filling notebooks with the same troubling questions. Ingrid told him something during their first real conversation that reshaped how he understood everything he had witnessed so far. She explained that the temptation to create money wasn't a flaw unique to weak or corrupt governments. It was a trap that even well-intentioned leaders fell into, because the costs of the shortcut always arrived later, while the benefits arrived immediately. A politician who raised taxes faced angry voters within weeks. A politician who quietly expanded the money supply might not face any consequences at all until years after leaving office, once the inflation finally worked its way through the economy. This mismatch in timing, Ingrid explained, was the real engine driving the pattern Marcus had been tracking. Human institutions, much like individual people, tended to prioritize immediate relief over distant consequences, especially when the distant consequences could plausibly be blamed on someone else entirely. She walked him through the case of Weimar Germany in far greater detail than any textbook had ever offered him. The government hadn't set out to destroy its own currency. It had simply faced war reparations so enormous that meeting them through taxation alone seemed politically and practically impossible. So they printed money instead, month after month, each time promising it would be the last necessary adjustment. Prices that had once felt stable began doubling within weeks, then within days, until workers demanded payment twice daily just to spend their wages, before the value evaporated by evening. Ingrid then showed him something that struck him even harder than the German example. She pulled out records from ancient Rome, where emperors had quietly reduced the silver content in coins century after century, shaving away real value while keeping the face amount stamped on each coin exactly the same. The mechanism was different: coins instead of paper, metal instead of digital entries, but the underlying temptation was identical across nearly 2,000 years of separation. Whenever a government needed more resources than it could honestly collect, someone eventually discovered a way to quietly dilute the value of existing money rather than confronting the harder political choice directly. Marcus asked her the question that had been building inside him for years. If this pattern repeated so consistently across different centuries, different currencies, and different political systems, why did each new generation seem to walk into the exact same trap, as though nobody had ever seen it happen before? Ingrid's answer was quieter than he expected, but it stayed with him for the rest of his career. She explained that the shortcut always felt different this time to the people living through it, because the earliest stages of currency dilution genuinely did feel like free money to almost everyone involved. Wages might rise alongside prices at first, creating an illusion of growing prosperity, even as real purchasing power stayed flat or slowly declined underneath the surface. Stock markets often climbed during these early phases too, since more currency chasing the same assets pushed prices upward in nominal terms, even without any real underlying growth. It was only later, once the dilution had run long enough, that the true cost finally became impossible to ignore. Savings accounts that once felt secure suddenly couldn't cover basic expenses. Fixed incomes that once seemed comfortable began falling further behind every single month. By then, Ingrid explained, the politicians who had originally chosen the shortcut were almost always long gone from office, replaced by new leaders who inherited the consequences without necessarily understanding the original cause. This created a strange kind of institutional amnesia, where each generation of leadership rediscovered the same shortcut independently, genuinely believing their own circumstances were different enough to avoid the outcomes that had doomed everyone before them. Marcus spent the next several years applying this lesson directly to his own trading decisions, watching for the early warning signs Ingrid had taught him to recognize. Rapid growth in the money supply, government deficits that kept expanding without any credible plan for repayment, central bankers using increasingly vague language whenever reporters asked direct questions about inflation. Each signal individually might mean very little, but together, layered across each other over several consecutive years, they formed a pattern that had preceded nearly every major currency crisis Marcus had studied throughout his growing collection of notebooks. By 1985, Marcus had built a reputation across the trading floor as someone who could sense trouble in a currency long before the headlines caught up to it. Colleagues began quietly asking for his opinion before major decisions, though few of them fully understood the years of patient study sitting behind his quiet, careful answers. What Marcus had ultimately come to understand went far beyond simple currency speculation or clever trading strategy. He had uncovered something closer to a law of human behavior, one that repeated itself endlessly, regardless of language, culture, or century. Every government shortcut built on quietly creating money followed the same 3 stages, almost without exception. First came relief, a genuine and immediate solution to whatever crisis had triggered the original spending. Wages rose, projects got funded, and citizens felt a fleeting sense of prosperity that seemed to prove the strategy had worked. Then came the slow, creeping stage that Marcus had spent years learning to recognize early. Prices began rising faster than wages could keep pace, savings quietly lost their purchasing power, and ordinary people started blaming everyone around them except the actual source of their shrinking security. Finally came the reckoning, the stage every government hoped desperately to avoid, but almost never did. Trust in the currency itself began to crack. Foreign investors pulled their capital elsewhere, and the very stability the original spending had tried to protect collapsed even further than if leaders had simply made the harder choice from the very beginning. Marcus watched this final stage play out with brutal clarity when he later studied Zimbabwe's currency collapse in the early 2000s. A case so extreme, it made even Weimar Germany look almost restrained by comparison. Prices there eventually doubled within hours rather than days, and the government kept printing larger and larger denominations of currency, until bills worth billions could barely purchase a loaf of bread. Citizens who had spent decades working, saving, and building modest financial security watched it all evaporate within a matter of months. Not because they had made poor choices, but because the very foundation beneath their money, the trust that gave it meaning in the first place, had been quietly hollowed out by leaders chasing an easier path. Marcus often thought back to his very first months in Zurich, watching senior traders whisper about the shortcut with that strange mixture of fascination and dread. He finally understood, after years of study, exactly why that reaction had made sense all along. The shortcut always looked like free money in the beginning, because the true cost never arrived on the same day as the benefit. It arrived later, often years later, quietly transferred onto the shoulders of people who had never been part of the original decision at all. This delay was precisely what made the illusion so powerful, and precisely why it kept repeating itself across different nations and different centuries, despite every historical warning available. Each new generation of leaders convinced themselves their situation was different, their control more precise, their circumstances uniquely suited to avoid the fate that had befallen every government before them. History, however, rarely agreed with that confidence. The mechanism remained exactly the same whether the year was 1923 or 1985 or any decade that followed afterward, because the mechanism was never really about politics or culture in the first place. It was about a simple, unavoidable truth that Marcus had spent his entire career learning to respect. Real wealth could only ever come from real production, from actual goods and services created through genuine effort and genuine resources. Money itself was never wealth. It was only a claim on that real production, a claim that could be diluted, stretched, and quietly weakened whenever more of it was created without any matching increase in real output. Governments that forgot this distinction or chose to ignore it for the sake of short-term political relief eventually paid a price far steeper than the one they had originally tried so desperately to avoid. And ordinary citizens, the ones who never sat in a single meeting where these decisions were made, almost always ended up paying that price on behalf of everyone else. That was the illusion of free money, patient, quiet, and endlessly repeating, waiting only for the next generation of leaders confident enough to believe they had finally found a way around it.